What if I told you that everything you've been running from in your life is actually the very thing that holds the key to your freedom? What if the parts of yourself you despise, the emotions you suppress, and the thoughts you refuse to acknowledge are not your enemies, but your greatest teachers waiting to be discovered? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, spent decades studying what he called the shadow, that hidden part of ourselves that we've learned to fear and reject. Jung discovered something profound. The moment we stop running from our dark side is the moment we begin to reclaim our wholeness, our power, and our authentic self. Today, you're going to discover the 7 transformative stages that occur when you finally turn to face what you've been avoiding. You'll learn why your shadow holds gifts you never imagined, how to recognize when you're ready for this sacred encounter, and most importantly, what happens to your life when you integrate these rejected parts of yourself. This isn't just psychological theory. This is a roadmap to becoming the complete human being you were meant to be. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." What he discovered through his work with thousands of patients and through his own courageous journey into his unconscious was that our greatest growth doesn't come from pursuing only the light within us, but from embracing the totality of who we are, including the parts we've been taught to hide. The first stage begins with what Jung called the initial confrontation. That moment when you realize you can no longer outrun yourself. Picture this. You're in a heated argument with someone, and suddenly you hear yourself saying something that shocks you. The words that come out of your mouth are cruel, petty, or vindictive in a way that doesn't match your self-image as a good person. In that moment, you catch a glimpse of your shadow, the part of you that exists whether you acknowledge it or not. Most people immediately recoil from this experience. They make excuses, blame the other person, or convince themselves it was just a momentary lapse. But for those ready to grow, this becomes a moment of recognition. You realize that this angry, jealous, or manipulative part isn't some foreign invader. It's you. It's been you all along, operating from the unconscious, influencing your decisions and relationships in ways you never understood. Jung understood that this initial confrontation is terrifying because it challenges our carefully constructed ego identity. We've spent years, sometimes decades, building an image of ourselves as patient, kind, rational, or strong. When the shadow emerges, it threatens this identity. But here's what Jung discovered. This threat is actually an invitation to become whole. The psychological consequence of this recognition is initially destabilizing. You might feel like you don't know yourself anymore. You might question everything you believed about your character. This disorientation is normal and necessary. Jung called it the dissolution of the persona. The mask we wear for the world begins to crack, revealing the more complex reality underneath. The second stage is what Jung termed the projection withdrawal. For most of your life, you've been unconsciously projecting your shadow onto other people. That colleague who irritates you with their arrogance, that family member whose selfishness drives you crazy, that public figure whose behavior disgusts you. Jung would suggest looking closer. These people are mirrors, reflecting back the parts of yourself you refuse to own. Consider Sarah, a woman who prided herself on being selfless and giving. She found herself constantly frustrated by what she perceived as the selfishness of others. Her sister never called enough. Her friends took advantage of her generosity, and her co-workers seemed to care only about themselves. Sarah spent years complaining about the narcissistic world around her until she began to explore Jung's work on projection. Through honest self-examination, Sarah began to recognize her own disowned selfishness. She realized that her compulsive giving was actually a sophisticated form of manipulation. She gave to others to feel needed, to maintain control, and to avoid the guilt of prioritizing her own needs. Her shadow contained a healthy selfishness that she'd never learned to integrate. The very quality she despised in others was the quality she most needed to develop in herself. This withdrawal of projections is liberating but disorienting. When you stop seeing others as the source of all that's wrong in your life, you reclaim tremendous energy that was previously bound up in judgment and resentment. But you also lose the comfortable illusion that you're fundamentally different from those you've criticized. This humbling recognition is essential for psychological growth. Jung observed that those who successfully navigate this stage begin to develop what he called psychological humility. They realize that the capacity for every human behavior, both light and dark, exists within them. This doesn't make them pessimistic about human nature. Rather, it makes them more compassionate and realistic about the complexity of being human. The third stage involves what Jung described as the dialogue with the shadow. Once you've recognized your dark side and withdrawn your projections, you begin the delicate work of actually engaging with these rejected parts of yourself. This isn't about becoming them or acting them out destructively. It's about understanding what they represent and what they need. Imagine your shadow as an abandoned child who has been locked in the basement of your psyche for years. This child might be angry, hurt, frightened, or rebellious. They've been banging on the door, trying to get your attention through symptoms, relationship problems, addictions, or sudden outbursts. The dialogue stage involves finally opening that door and listening to what this part of you has been trying to communicate. Jung worked with a successful businessman named Klaus, who suffered from chronic anxiety and insomnia. Klaus prided himself on being logical, controlled, and professional. Through analysis, they discovered that Klaus had completely rejected his sensitive, emotional side, what Jung might call his inner feminine or anima. This rejected part was creating chaos in his unconscious, manifesting as anxiety attacks and an inability to rest. The dialogue process involved Klaus learning to honor his emotional intelligence, his need for beauty and connection, and his intuitive wisdom. As he integrated these previously rejected qualities, his anxiety diminished and his relationships deepened. He didn't become less masculine or professional. He became more whole, with access to a fuller range of human capacities. This stage requires tremendous courage because it involves sitting with uncomfortable emotions and impulses without immediately acting on them or pushing them away. You might discover your capacity for rage, your deep well of sadness, your hidden arrogance, or your secret shame. Jung emphasized that the goal isn't to eliminate these aspects, but to understand their purpose and find constructive ways to honor their energy. The psychological transformation that occurs during this dialogue is profound. You begin to experience what Jung called psychological democracy, a recognition that all parts of your psyche have value and deserve representation in your conscious life. This doesn't mean acting out every impulse, but rather understanding the legitimate needs and perspectives that your shadow carries. If you've been following this journey so far, you might be recognizing aspects of your own shadow work. You might be remembering moments when you've caught glimpses of your rejected self, or relationships where you've been projecting qualities you couldn't own. This recognition is the beginning of transformation. If this exploration resonates with you, consider subscribing for more insights into Jung's revolutionary understanding of the human psyche. Your willingness to look honestly at yourself is already a profound act of courage. The fourth stage is what Jung called the integration of opposites. This is where the real alchemy begins. Having recognized and dialogued with your shadow, you now face the challenge of finding ways to honor both your light and dark aspects in your daily life. This isn't about compromising your values or abandoning your moral compass. It's about expanding your understanding of what it means to be human. Consider the common shadow quality of anger. Many people, especially those raised in families that viewed anger as unacceptable, have completely disowned their capacity for righteous indignation. They become chronic people pleasers, unable to set boundaries or stand up for themselves. When they begin shadow work, they often discover a fierce warrior energy that has been suppressed for years. The integration process involves learning to channel this anger constructively. Instead of exploding in rage or swallowing their frustration, they learn to use their anger as information about their values and boundaries. They develop the ability to be firm without being cruel, to advocate for themselves without attacking others. The shadow quality of anger becomes transformed into the valuable capacity for appropriate assertiveness. Jung observed that this integration process often involves what he called holding the tension of opposites. You might need to honor both your need for solitude and your desire for connection, your ambition and your desire for peace, your skepticism and your faith. Rather than choosing one side and rejecting the other, psychological maturity involves learning to hold both truths simultaneously. This is perhaps one of Jung's most radical insights, that psychological health doesn't come from being consistently good, positive, or light, but from being consciously complex. The integrated person doesn't deny their capacity for jealousy, greed, or selfishness. They understand these capacities as part of their full humanity and find ways to honor the underlying needs without causing harm. The consequence of this integration is a profound sense of authenticity and personal power. When you're no longer spending energy suppressing parts of yourself or maintaining a false persona, you have access to your full psychological resources. You become more creative, more decisive, more present in relationships, and more capable of handling life's challenges. The fifth stage involves what Jung termed the recognition of the collective shadow. As you become more comfortable with your own darkness, you begin to see the shadow operating not just in individuals, but in groups, cultures, and entire civilizations. You recognize that the very qualities your society most condemns are often the ones it most needs to integrate. Jung witnessed this phenomenon most dramatically during World War II, when an entire nation fell under the spell of what he called possession by the shadow. The German people, known for their culture and sophistication, became capable of unspeakable cruelty. Jung understood that this wasn't because Germans were inherently evil, but because they had collectively projected their shadow onto other groups and failed to recognize their own capacity for darkness. On a smaller scale, you might notice this in your family, workplace, or community. The qualities that your group most vehemently rejects are often the ones that are secretly operating unconsciously within the group itself. A family that prides itself on being above materialism might be unconsciously driven by status and image concerns. A spiritual community that condemns ego might be rife with subtle power struggles and spiritual superiority. Recognizing the collective shadow is both sobering and liberating. It helps you understand that the problems in your relationships, your workplace, or your society aren't simply the result of individual moral failings, but of collective unconsciousness. This understanding can free you from the burden of trying to fix everyone around you and help you focus on your own contribution to collective healing. Jung believed that individuals who do their own shadow work become less susceptible to collective possession. They're less likely to get swept up in mob mentality, scapegoating, or us versus them thinking. They become what he called conscious participants in the collective, able to see clearly and respond wisely rather than react unconsciously. The sixth stage is perhaps the most mysterious and transformative, what Jung called the transcendent function. This occurs when the conscious mind and the unconscious, including the shadow, begin to work together creatively rather than in opposition. It's as if the internal civil war ends and your psyche reorganizes itself around a deeper center of wisdom. People in this stage often report experiences of unusual creativity, insight, and synchronicity. They find themselves making decisions not just from their rational mind or their emotional impulses, but from a deeper knowing that seems to integrate both. They become more intuitive without losing their capacity for logical thinking, more compassionate without losing their ability to discern. Jung experienced this himself during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological exploration that lasted several years. During this time, he dialogued with various figures from his unconscious, including shadow aspects, and recorded these encounters in what became known as the Red Book. This process fundamentally transformed his understanding of psychology and led to many of his most important insights. The transcendent function isn't something you can force or manufacture. It emerges naturally when you've done the preparatory work of shadow integration. It represents a new level of psychological organization where your conscious intentions and unconscious wisdom collaborate rather than conflict. Decisions become clearer, relationships become more authentic, and your life begins to align with what Jung called your true self, rather than just your ego's preferences. This stage often coincides with what Jung called the individuation process, the lifelong journey of becoming who you uniquely are, rather than who others expect you to be. Your shadow, once integrated, becomes a source of vitality and authenticity, rather than a source of shame or unconscious sabotage. Now we arrive at the seventh and most profound stage, what Jung called the return to wholeness. This isn't a destination you reach once and maintain forever. It's an ongoing process of conscious living that honors the full spectrum of your humanity. People who have integrated their shadow don't become perfect or eliminate their dark impulses. They become conscious of them and able to channel them constructively. Consider the transformation of Marcus, a man who spent 40 years trying to be the perfect son, husband, and employee. His shadow contained enormous reserves of rebellion, creativity, and authentic self-expression that he had suppressed to meet others' expectations. When a midlife crisis forced him to confront his unlived life, he began the difficult work of befriending his shadow. The process wasn't smooth. Marcus went through periods of depression, anger, and confusion as he questioned everything he had built his identity around. But as he learned to honor his need for creative expression, his desire for adventure, and his capacity for healthy selfishness, he became more alive than he had ever been. His relationships deepened because he was finally present as his authentic self, rather than as a carefully constructed persona. Marcus didn't abandon his responsibilities or become reckless. Instead, he found ways to honor both his dutiful side and his rebellious side. He started the creative business he had always dreamed of while maintaining his commitment to his family. He learned to say no to obligations that drained him while saying yes to opportunities that energized him. The integration of his shadow didn't make him selfish. It made him whole. This return to wholeness has ripple effects that extend far beyond the individual. Jung observed that people who have integrated their shadow become what he called carriers of consciousness in their families and communities. They're less likely to perpetuate unconscious patterns of harm, more likely to see situations clearly, and more capable of responding to conflict with wisdom rather than reactivity. They also become more genuinely compassionate because they understand their own capacity for the behaviors they see in others. Having faced their own greed, they can respond to others' greed with understanding rather than judgment. Having acknowledged their own capacity for cruelty, they can witness others' cruelty without dehumanizing them while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. Jung believed that this individual work of shadow integration was essential for the healing of collective wounds. He wrote, "The world is in a bad state, but everything will become still worse unless each of us does his best. And nothing can be done until each individual realizes his responsibility and does something about it. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of shadow integration is the way it transforms your relationship with life itself. When you're no longer exhausting yourself trying to maintain a perfect image or suppress unwanted aspects of yourself, you have access to what Jung called your life force, the raw energy that wants to express itself through your unique existence. People who have done this work often report feeling more alive, more creative, more decisive, and more genuinely peaceful than they ever imagined possible. They're no longer at war with themselves, which means they can engage with life's challenges from a place of inner unity rather than internal conflict. This doesn't mean their lives become problem-free or that they never experience difficult emotions. Rather, they develop what Jung called the capacity to suffer consciously, the ability to meet life's inevitable challenges without being overwhelmed by them or needing to escape into unconscious patterns. They also develop what he termed psychological flexibility, the ability to access different aspects of their personality as situations require. They can be gentle when gentleness is needed and fierce when fierceness is called for. They can be social when connection serves them and solitary when solitude is necessary. The integration of their shadow gives them access to their full range of human capacities. As we near the end of this exploration, it's important to understand that the journey of shadow integration is not a linear process with a clear beginning and end. Jung viewed it as a spiral path that you traverse multiple times throughout your life, each time at a deeper level of understanding and integration. You might think you've integrated a particular shadow aspect only to discover new layers of it during times of stress or transition. You might find that life circumstances activate shadow material you thought you had resolved. This isn't a failure. It's the natural rhythm of psychological growth. Jung emphasized that this work requires what he called a religious attitude, not necessarily belief in a particular doctrine, but a sense of reverence for the mystery of your own psyche and a willingness to be transformed by the encounter with your unconscious. It requires humility, courage, and patience with the slow process of inner change. The work also requires what Jung called the courage to be disliked. As you become more authentic and stop performing the persona that others expect, some people in your life may be uncomfortable with your changes. They may prefer the version of you that was more predictable, even if that version was less alive. Your growth inevitably challenges others to look at their own authenticity, and not everyone welcomes that invitation. But for those who persist in this journey, the rewards are profound. Jung wrote about what he called the second half of life, a time when external achievements become less important than inner development, when the focus shifts from building a life that looks successful to building a life that feels meaningful. This shift often coincides with a deeper acceptance of mortality and an appreciation for what Jung called the fleeting beauty of existence. When you're no longer spending energy maintaining false personas or running from unwanted aspects of yourself, you become more present to the preciousness of each moment. You also develop what Jung termed the capacity for paradox, the ability to hold seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. You can be strong and vulnerable, confident and humble, independent and connected. The integration of your shadow allows you to embrace the full complexity of human existence rather than trying to reduce yourself to simple categories. As we conclude this journey through the 7 stages of embracing your dark side, I want to leave you with Jung's most hopeful insight, that every aspect of your shadow, no matter how disturbing or unwanted it seems, contains what he called the seed of transformation. The very qualities you've spent your life trying to eliminate or hide are often the ones that, when consciously integrated, become your greatest sources of strength and wisdom. Your anger might become your capacity for appropriate boundaries. Your sadness might become your depth of empathy. Your selfishness might become your healthy self-advocacy. Your fear might become your wisdom about real danger. Your pride might become your genuine self-confidence. This transformation doesn't happen automatically. It requires the conscious work of dialogue, understanding, and integration. But Jung's decades of research and clinical work demonstrated that this transformation is not only possible, but natural when we stop fighting our own nature and start working with it consciously. So I invite you to consider, what aspects of yourself have you been running from? What emotions do you immediately push away? What thoughts do you refuse to acknowledge? What behaviors do you see in others that trigger your strongest judgments? These might be doorways to the very qualities your soul most needs to reclaim.